Welcome. It's great to have you here at the Old State House. My name is Rebecca Tabor-Conover. I'm the head of public programs here, and we're delighted to have you with us today for our February conversation at noon. This is a monthly program, so you should have on your seat a flyer that has a list of our upcoming programs all the way through May. And if you came in a little bit later and didn't get one of those, please do check on the table as we have plenty of flyers to take with you. Also, I hope you'll consider joining us on February the 16th, which is a Saturday. We'll be hosting a special program called Encounters, which will be focused on the Amistad trial. And as many of you know, part of that happened here at the Old State House. There's also a flyer. We invite you to sign up and come join us for that. And I promise the infomercial is almost over, but we also have a survey that we do ask that you please fill out. We actually do read them and get ideas for programs. And the other part of my job is that I not only run public programs, but I'm head of Connecticut History Day, and we are less than a month away from contest season. So I would invite you to consider judging because we need your help to help students across Connecticut. We have been doing conversations at noon here at the Old State House since 2009, and it's always fun to get to welcome back old friends. And Steve Thornton is one of those good friends to the Old State House. As many of you know, Steve is the creator of the Shoeleather History Project, which is a website that documents and promotes, quote, history from below. He explores the stories of ordinary people who are the real makers of history with walking tours, workshops, and public events. Steve has written 2 books, Wicked Hartford and a Local History of the IWW or Wobblies. And just so that you know, Steve has those books for sale after the program, so stop by and see him after the lecture. Steve retired in 2013 from his position as a vice president of District 1199 SEIU, the largest healthcare workers union in Connecticut. Today's program is focused on the contribution of the community of worship here in Hartford. For 200 years, African Americans, both enslaved and free, have maintained this vital community of worship in Hartford. The Talcott Street Church also provided a safe haven to speak out and organize around American slavery, the primary moral issue of the day. As the church grew, it became the home of women and men who were powerful examples of faith-based justice. Faith Congregational Church continues this proud tradition today. It is my pleasure today to welcome Steve Thornton to introduce us to the stories of some of these fascinating figures and uncovers previously unknown stories that are relevant to our times today. Thank you.
Thanks. Who's here from Faith Congregational? Raise your hand. Oh. Thank you so much. I'm going to be talking. They're going to be saying, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. No, and who's here from Capital Community College? Come on, raise your hand, raise your hand. Beautiful. Let's give them a round of applause. And who here is a Patriots fan? No, never mind. That doesn't matter. I don't follow. Okay, so Talcott Congregational Church was 2 blocks down this way, and it's ultimately been transformed into Faith, which is on Main Street in Hartford. And I have to say that if you wanted to find one place, one physical location where the Black freedom movement evolved and just generated so much amazing activism, it would be Talcott Church, Talcott Congregational Street Church. And I've written way more than I can put in this 30 minutes or so, but everybody should know them, all right? You will know more than 120,000 people in this city and probably most of the rest of the world. In 2016, I came here to speak about Emily Pankhurst. Now, she was a British suffragist who spoke just right around the corner at Parsons Theater on suffrage. And at that time, I asked, what's an old white guy doing talking about women's history? Good question. And today, I come back to you with the same question. What's an old white guy doing talking about Black history? And the answer for both questions is the same. It's old white men who've written all the history and gotten it so wrong. Am I right? Ignored it, misrepresented it, twisted it around. Mike Pence says on Martin Luther King Day, man, he'd be Trump's guy, you know? I mean, this is just, I consider that a sin. And I'm not much of a religious guy. So I want to start by, I'm going to do a little biographical sketches. So you may say, oh, I need to know more about this person. Well, you can find out more, but I have limited time, so I can answer questions too, hopefully, for you. On the morning, this is Talcott Street Congregational Church. On the morning of Wednesday, August 1st, 1860, hundreds of African Americans, women, men, children, from Hartford and surrounding towns gathered at the Talcott Church on the corner of Talcott and Market Street. They formed a procession, marched up to Main Street, north to Albany Avenue, to a place called Carter's Grove. It was a little park. This was probably the largest gathering of black folks in the history of the city up until that time. They were celebrating the emancipation, not of their own land, not of their own people, but of enslaved people in the British West Indies from Great Britain that had taken place 22 years ago, and they were still celebrating it. On the islands of Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, and a dozen other places, black people gained their full freedom and began celebrating on this day, their full freedom from the British Empire. And because that history is not really valued, there is very little of it. And so you'll see photographs here today of people who aren't really the people I'm talking about. Unless you see their name, then it's more or less the actual person. I have biographical information, but there's a lot more needed. I only have pictures of Reverend Pennington, James Mars, and Hosea Easton, the young virtuoso. The day of this rally, Reverend Amos Freeman was the pastor of Talcott Street. Because he and his congregation welcomed music and musical instruments in the church.
Know the news than it is all about
Attention by
and having a way to indulge
within the
committee within this
At the time, and this was the first and only black church for a number of years. Because they had music, they were derided as theater. Now, I think theater is cool, and I think theater in church is perfect, but they didn't care. They did it anyway. On Emancipation Day, there was a joyful sound. Mitchell's colored brass band, music, singing, speech making, and they had a great time. It was a celebration. And this was significant for a couple of reasons, not the least of which was that local African Americans were celebrating the freedom of other people outside this country, other black people outside this country, because the United States had not ended slavery. Black people had been working on that for decades and decades, but it hadn't happened, even as of 1860. 8 months before this parade, John Brown was executed in Charlottesville, Virginia. 8 months after this parade, the American Civil War began. So to put that in context, this is a dynamic community that's well aware of everything going around them in the country. A lesser known but striking, no less striking event in December of 1860, this is, oh, by the way, and the reason I do this is because Talcott Street Church today is the inheritor and continues all those traditions. We'll talk about him later. 8 months, and a lesser known but just as striking an incident happened when 300 children white children, sang Christmas carols in front of City Hall. And they did an encore, and that encore was, anybody guess? Dixie. I wish I was in the land of cotton. What? In Connecticut in 1860? Yes, yes. That was the mindset and probably the least offensive of things that happened to the African American community at that time. So this story emerges where ordinary people, free and enslaved, those with seemingly so little power, used multiple strategies to make their freedom a reality. And this public demonstration was one of the first. Over the years, Talcott Street Church became Faith Street, and all through that period of time, the church supported the Amistad captives who went on trial right here for their first trials and then down to New Haven. They disobeyed publicly the fugitive slave law, which happened in 1850, and said, not only do you have the right to capture people who ran away from their slave masters, you have the duty and responsibility, and you could go to jail if you didn't do it. And they publicly spoke out. They convened a national convention of African American ministers in 1858, and they hosted members of the Scottsboro Nine in the early 1900s. People know the Scottsboro Boys? Anybody? Yeah, excellent. I'm going to focus on one family in particular, the Eastons. As you can tell, this is not a photograph of the Eastons. But I'm going to leave them for the last, because there's an awful lot of information that I think we need to get more available to people. I'm going to start, though, with the women of Talcott Street Church. Pardon me. I'm going to start with the women of Talcott Street Church, because usually in churches, and usually in the early days, women, although they play very, very key roles in the church, they are not given that credit. And so there are three women, at least, I just want to mention: Rebecca Primus, Ann Plato, and Hetty Primus. Hetty is short for Mehetabel. I think I said that right. After the war, the Civil War, Reconstruction was a far-reaching project that sent energy and money and supplies and to teachers, black and white, who went into southern states and started the first public schools there. Not only did black people have no public schools, obviously, because it was against the law to read or to learn to read. It was against the law since they were the colonies in South Carolina. But they knew that education was critical for people being able to, after they were emancipated, to be able to succeed. The New England Freedmen's Society was a support group, just a support group that grew up like others, and it helped the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a national effort, ratified by law, unfunded but underfunded. And this was the instrument, really imperfect instrument, but really important instrument that tried to give support to the formerly enslaved population of 4 million plus in the South. Now, we know that Rebecca Primus was a teacher in the Second African School on Elm Street in Hartford. Now, Elm Street is right around Bushnell Park, where a black community, and Gold Street, where a black community lived. And when the church spruced up Gold Street and the elders, the black population got dispersed, and the Irish population. They were both living together. She was a member, Rebecca was, of the Talcott Street Church, and her pastor was James Pennington. No, I'm sorry. Yep. And so we have an information about Rebecca Primus since 1999, where a book came out about the letters between her and a very close friend, Addie Brown, who was a domestic service servant in Hartford. And so Rebecca talked about what was going on down south, and Addie mostly talked about her love life. But it was a really important dialogue that has only recently been discovered, Ann Plato. Some critics from later generations found Ann Plato's writing, this is what they used, terms they used, over-moralizing, routine, lacking in originality, absolutely jejune. I said that right, though, didn't I? Yeah, okay, thank you. Devoid of intellect, vapid, without literary value, you get the idea. Ann Plato, not much of a poet. But that's a very weak reading of her work. She was 16 when she wrote a book. It had prose and poetry and essays in it. It was the only book we know of that she wrote. And so it had value simply for that. But there were two poems that were particularly useful for us today. One was called First in America. It was called Natives in America. And it was about a young girl, American Indian girl, talking to her father saying, "Tell me about the old days." And the father says, "Yeah, they were terrible." And she writes this all out. And why does she write this particular story? Because at the time, the general myth was that A, all American Indians had been wiped out of New England, and B, that was a good thing. And she brings, pathos and remembrance to this particular situation. It must have been that she wrote this because she herself was part Native American. She was Missiniok, and Missiniok people in the Narragansett language meant the regular folks, the common people, the majority of people, because they didn't all, after the diaspora of the Native Americans in the 1600s and early 1700s, there were tribes were few and far between. A lot of people lived together, and a lot of people intermarried. And so she was part of that condition. Her second poem was the 1st of August. And remember what I talked about August 1st? That was Emancipation Day. There she is. Not really her. She was celebratory. She was celebrating the Emancipation Day. Now that's political stuff, and you won't find Lady Lydia Sigourney writing about that, but she did. So she used her roots as part of the her subject matter. I'm going to go back now because I skipped over a little bit. This is the only known photo of Rebecca Primus. And as you can see, it's not a great photo. I wish we had a better one. But since she went down south and she started a school, and she stayed there for about 4 years until finally the federal government abandoned the Reconstruction effort, she was one of these stalwarts in Royal Oaks, Maryland, which I look on their website and they've got nothing about Rebecca Primus here today, but that was clearly the first public school and the first school that worked on behalf of young African Americans. Rebecca Primus had a brother named Nelson Primus, and these are some of the paintings that Nelson Primus did. Isn't that extraordinary? Right? Very, very poor folks. I know there. Who wrote The Black Middle Class in Hartford? Okay, she's not here today. Okay, I love the book. I don't think there was a middle class in Hartford at the time. Middle class means something very, very different from me, but they were working class, and they were certainly not well-to-do or well-off, and they were always in fear of their lives, as we'll find out later. But yet and still, Rebecca Primus and Nelson Primus succeeded and thrived, and that, I would argue, was because of the Talcott Street Church community. There we are. That's the Emancipation coin that was put out after the West Indian celebrations, 1838. This was my interpretation of Ann Plato's poem, Natives in America, and now we're at James Pennington. James Pennington had been warmly received in Scotland. He had his biography published in England, and he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Heidelberg University in Germany. But back home, that was just while he traveled in Europe. Back home, he was a wanted man. And that's because Hartford's Reverend Jim Pennington was originally Maryland's Jim Pembroke, an enslaved black man who successfully made a daring escape and traveled north. He got his own education. He was sheltered by a sympathetic Quaker family, and he changed his name from Jim Pembroke to James Pennington in honor of Isaac Pennington, who was a 17th century defender of the Quaker faith and Quaker beliefs. He attended Yale, he studied for the ministry, and in 1838 he started preaching from the Talcott Street Congregational Church. That same year, he presided over the marriage of his friend and fellow abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, to Anna Murray in New York. He spent his life serving congregations in New York, Maine, Florida, and Mississippi. He battled alcoholism, he battled the premature death of his wife, and he battled fights and divisions within the bigger abolition movement. He finally resolved his own enslaved status with the support of and in coordination with John Hooker, who dealt with the slave owner and bought his Pennington's freedom, and then emancipated him the next day. Now, the most important thing I want to say about Reverend James Pennington, for now, is that he was arrested in New York City in 1855 for riding on a segregated streetcar in New York. There had been a long-standing effort going on to desegregate streetcars, and so he joined the fight. The campaign took the case to Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, and they won. Exactly 100 years before Rosa Parks broke the Jim Crow barrier in Montgomery, Alabama. You see how long this struggle, and longer, has been, and still is. 2 decades before the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which confirmed black men's right to vote, Hartford resident Selah Mills Africanus was in New Haven at the Colored Men's Convention. He was a teacher of African American students here in Hartford through the church, and he organized for the right to vote. He was also a recording secretary for a lot of these meetings and conventions and public events, so he had a responsibility of making sure the message got out to the public. Shortly after the Fugitive Slave Law, the 1850 law, he issued a broadside, and here it is on the right. You won't be able to read it, so don't try. That's not what it's meant for. You see the hole it's got in the middle? I don't know where that comes from. Shortly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, Africanus himself issued a broadside that reprinted the entire law along with 12 bullet points, a synopsis of the legalese of the statute, what it really meant, because, you know, it's written in legalese, so, like, you can't even get through it, let alone understand, or I couldn't, and understand it. The Fugitive Slave Act, he wrote, quote, violates the spirit and letter of the Constitution. It clothes any ruffian as a slave catcher with magisterial authority. That means they were almost above the law. They could get anybody off the street, say you're a runaway slave, and send them back to the South and get money for it. In September 30th, Talcott Street issued an eloquent and powerful resolution that condemned the Fugitive Slave Act. It was composed in part by Augustus Washington. People may know him just 5 doors down from the First Congregational Church. He was a photographer. He was a daguerreotypist. Took these amazing pictures of John Brown and many others, very skilled. And he was also a teacher, and he was a thinker. He was thinking about how do we solve the fundamental moral question of the day, which is slavery. In that particular resolution, They quoted the Declaration of Independence and entirely repudiated people who did not resist this law. In other words, people who were too scared to break the fugitive slave law to protect black people. They repudiated those folks as absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. This is James Mars, and this really is James Mars. I found two pictures of him. One of them is usually on the book that you could buy off any online bookstore, and then the second one is him, I think, slightly younger. He was a political activist, a founder of Talcott Street Church, and a deacon there. He was born in Connecticut, a slave, and he was enslaved for a good part of his life by a congregational minister, a white congregational minister up in Canaan, Connecticut. He escaped, and the escape story is a wonderful story. You'd think it was a movie script, but it was all real. He was way smarter than the congregational minister and the guys he hired to find James and his brother. But he escaped, eventually bought his freedom, raised a family, and wrote a brief but revealing autobiography in 1864. And I think that's it. You can read all this stuff. It's all online, or there are hard copies of it. They're easily readable, and they tell you a way lot more than I can. This is the resolution that they worked on at Talcott Street against the against the Fugitive Slave Act. This, in my mind anyway, is Nancy Bullock. It's not a real picture of her. Nancy Jackson. James Mars played a major role in Jackson versus Bullock, which was a court case that you could read about today anywhere because it broke new ground. Only Massachusetts had done this earlier. And, oh no, not earlier, just the same year, essentially. It's known, Jackson versus Bullock is known as a court case, but think of it. The enslaved Nancy Jackson, who was living here by herself in Hartford for a couple of years, until her owner from Georgia, James Bullock, said, "No, I want to take you back now." And she said, I'm free. And they said, "No, you're not." And she said, "Yes, I am." And she sued this guy in court. Now, so that's what you know. But think of this. Since James Mars was so close to her, who do you think built a community around her for moral and economic support? James Mars and the church. Who went with her when she had to go to court? How many people have ever been to court and not liked it? Yep. And she had to handle the curiosity and the possible hostility from the white public in this town. What would have happened if she had lost her case? Would James Mars and others simply have turned her over to her slave master, her former slave master? Not a chance. She would either hide in plain sight, as Reverend James Pennington did. He was living as a free man, but he actually had this legal, anchor hanging over him of slavery. Or she might have jumped the train to the Underground Railroad, because as I mentioned before, Talcott Street Church was also a part of that system. At the age of 74, while writing his book, James Mars was also tending his farm. This is a guy who spent his entire life working on behalf of others. This is Harper's Magazine, a cover illustration, and you see black men voting for the first time, and you see the different ages and stations. The older man may have been a farmer or a blacksmith. The man in the middle had some kind of business, and the third man was a member of the armed forces. And now we get finally to the Eastons. The Eastons were a distinguished African-American family in New England. Their family can be traced back to the 1690s. They were enslaved by Nicholas Easton, who was a founder of Providence, Rhode Island, and they were emancipated by other Eastons who joined the Quaker faith. And when they joined the Quaker faith, they said, we don't have slaves. And so this family in the 1700s moved to Massachusetts. One of them was a man named James Easton. He married Sarah Dunbar. They had 8 children, including Hosea Easton, who is the distinguished man in the center. James, the father, who I don't have here, was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. He also possessed Native American heritage, and this is all pretty well documented. And so that means Hosea did as well. James was a blacksmith, he was an iron worker, and he provided lots of iron for big construction projects in Boston. He opened a manual labor school for young black youth, which Hosea attended in 1816. Right? He was educating in the North what they wouldn't get to do for, almost 50 years in the South. Hosea, the young Hosea, married in the 1820s to Louisa Matrick. He became a minister and an effective abolitionist agitator. Hosea learned courage and justice when he was just a few years old. The Easton family went to a church around Middleborough, Massachusetts, and all colored members of the congregation had to sit in a newly constructed Negro porch, as it was sometimes euphemistically called. In other words, it was the back of the bus. James Easton and family refused to submit to this act of racism. He and his family continued to sit down on the main floor of the church until they were literally forced out of the building. In a similar situation, they joined another church, a Baptist church. I think the first one was Congregational. Easton purchased a pew for his family, which people did at that time. They bought pews. They do some places still, right? And then this was their pew, but it was also a way to support the church economically. He bought a pew from a sympathetic white member of the church. And when the Easton family continued to occupy the pew against the wishes of the church officials and most of the congregation, the family came in one Sunday to find that the pew had been painted with tar, with pitch. Undaunted, James Easton, his wife Sarah, Jose, and the 7 other little Eastons responded by returning the following Sunday with their own chairs. Yeah, nice, huh? This conflict continued until the Eastons were barred from that church. Of course, the fight didn't stop there. The Reverend Hosea Easton were the first Americans, as far as we know, to engage in a sit-in for racial justice. Now we can connect that incident to 1819 here in Hartford, where black folks were attending the first Congregational Church down the street near the ancient burying ground in front of it. And they segregated the same way. And the African Americans there said, no, this does not suit us. So in 1819, they left that church, started the African Religious Society, and that was really the birth of the Talcott Street Church, even though the building didn't go up till later. Hosea really entered the big time with all this experience at his back at the age of 30 with a Thanksgiving Day address as a minister in Providence, Rhode Island, attacking racism and slavery. It was frank. It was explicit. It was an angry condemnation of the brutalities of slavery mixed with the need for spiritual uplift of black people. In this talk, he also criticized the American Colonization Society, which is like the watered-down way to say you care about slaves. And what it was a lot of white people who said, we'll give you a boat fare to go back to Africa. Now, a lot of these people had not been in Africa, ever, but they wanted them out of the country. And people like Hosea Easton understood this and the other main abolitionists at the time understood this. He said that the colonization society was a diabolical pursuit where they will steal the sons of Africa, bring them to America, keep them bondage for centuries, then transport them back to Africa, by which America gets her drudgery done at little expense. I mean, that you couldn't say that any better. In 1833, he took over the pastorate of the Talcott Street Church, and 2 years later, there was a 3-day riot right here, in Front Street and Talcott Street, where white crowds harassed and then attacked African Americans, no matter who they were or what they were doing. Now, of course, they never went to the newspapers and said, here's why we did it, but we figure that there were men's suffrage meetings going on, and James Mars was one of the people who was leading them, and that was no secret. And that was a step way too far. You're going to vote like we vote? No, you're not. And they tried to erase that effort and couldn't. 2 months after this, it wasn't really an explanation, but unknown people wrote this and printed this declaration of the sentiments of the people of Hartford. They meant the white people of Hartford regarding abolitionists. So they didn't really attack black people here. They just said, nah, not smart enough to vote. But they did, well, that's attacking them. But they attacked the abolitionists as devils. And they blamed them for all the country's woes. And this was the formal face of the racism that the church and African American community actually faced in that period of time. Reverend Hosea Easton died on July 6, 1837. He was only 38 years old. Nobody really knows why he died, but people say that the stress that he was under from the attacks that he received, because he also traveled all around speaking on abolition, that contributed to it. And William Lloyd Garrison, in The Liberator, his newspaper, noted him as a great loss to the movement, but he said that our loss is God's infinite gain. Now, here's what I like the best about Hosea Easton's thoughts. He termed one blood as sort of the essence of his philosophy. One blood, all written as one word. One blood. Shades of Bob Marley, who wrote, what did he write? One love, all people, sorry? One heart. Let's get together and we'll feel all right. This is the same idea, the same concept, where all humanity, whatever the skin color, is united. Bob Marley had probably not read Hosea Easton, even though he put out his own, Hosea Easton put out his own book, which had been lost for quite a while. Okay, moving to his son, Samson Easton, in the center. You can't really see it, but Samson is holding a long black drape. And on his left, our right, there's Madam Justice right here in the old State House. He was the son, and he's standing there with his father Hosea, of Hosea and Louisa, and he moved to Hartford with them. He was most certainly named after his great-grandfather on his mother's side, Sampson Dunbar of Massachusetts, who died at 83. Samson was not a famous man, and you will not find anything written about him. Nothing written about him. In fact, every time they talk about Hosea Easton, they said he had 2 kids. That's it. He had 2 kids, and Samson Easton was one of them. There were 3 events that showed the same courage and anti-slavery politics that his father demonstrated and his grandfather demonstrated. First, in 1858, Sam Easton attempted to save a woman known as Aunt Mary Robinson, a longtime friend. They grew up together in Hartford, from being killed by her husband, Ben. They were at a small party in the Robinsons' place. They were playing music, maybe drinking a little bit, although the only person who was actually intoxicated was Ben Robinson. He was drunk and abusive to Mary because she was dancing with Samson, although it could have been any other number of things that would get him angry. But Samson and Mary had known each other since they went to the church, Talcott Street Church, and the school there. By all accounts, Samson tried to peacefully de-escalate the situation, even after Ben punched him. He didn't punch back. Samson and his friends started to leave when Ben Robinson stabbed Mary Robinson many times. Samson then put himself in the middle of the attack and was also wounded. Unfortunately, Mary Robinson died. Now, researching this incident helped me understand more about Samson's life. He was, in fact, an entrepreneur. He was listed as a livery driver or a hack driver, but he also owned the Easton Academy of Music on Commerce Street in 1860. And Commerce Street was the worst street in Hartford because it's the closest to the Connecticut River. And what's wrong with that? Yes, overflowed every year. And Commerce Street was right there. But still, he had this music shop. He crafted, repaired, and played banjos, fiddles, and possibly other musical instruments. Second incident, 2 years later, Mrs. Thomas Flaherty, an Irish woman, attempted to commit suicide by jumping off the railroad bridge into the Connecticut River. Samson jumped in the cold water, this was April, and rescued her with some difficulty. He brought her to shore, and she rewarded him with a slap in the face. There could be different reasons for that, but none of them he deserved. I couldn't find any evidence that they knew each other. This is mostly a spur-of-the-moment decision that shows his character and his personal sense of courage. And here's the last incident, and most important. On December 2nd, 1859, there was a dance right around here that the fire department was holding. And it was going on way into the morning. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. And they were dancing and drinking and looking outside. And they saw, at the top of the old State House, they saw some lights in the belfry. They called a cop, and the cop climbed up and apprehended Samson Easton, who had a friend there, a white man, Charles Boyle. But even though they had been captured, Easton and Boyle had completed their objective, which was to drape the figure of Madam Justice in black as a mourning for John Brown, who was to be executed that day. They put him, there were sort of commemorations all over New England like that. Almost all of them were illegal, right? Thoreau tried to do one. They said, I want to blow off the cannon, and the townspeople said, no, he shouldn't have asked, right? He should have done it. But Samson Easton did it. They spent the night in jail, and the newspaper said that local Hartford Democrats said, oh, you got put up to do it by a local Republican, and Samson said, no, we did this on our own. Easton and Boyle spent the night in the Hartford jail while the authorities tried to figure out what to do with them. It was decided that the two, quote, could be charged with neither insurrection nor resurrection, and they were released less than an hour after John Brown was hanged. And last but certainly not least, and I'll be done in just a moment, is Hosea Easton the Younger. This is a real picture of him. He looks pretty dapper, pretty darn dapper, and I'll tell you why in just a second. He was Samson's son. He was born around 1850, although we really don't know. The only thing we know for sure is where he died. He didn't seem to get off to a good start. He was a wild child. He implicated his father, unknowingly, Samson, by bringing home a lot of stolen hams and hiding them and Sampson's Place. He disturbed the peace with his friends and got arrested. He worked, but Sam had a really good reputation, so this kid never, got sent away and locked away. He worked as a waiter and a porter in local restaurants, but at some point in time, he must have picked up one of the banjos his father Sampson made. He was good at it, really good. Minstrel shows and other variety acts visited frequently at the Roberts Opera House here and the Allen Hall. It's hard to know if he actually saw these shows, but I think it's actually very likely. The Georgia minstrels, this is a Hartford Courant ad, were frequent performers in Hartford. They featured, among others, Dick Little, the greatest banjoist living. Who knows what Hosea Easton, then 16 years old, thought of this act. Now, in this one, you see it says the Great Slave Troupe. That was a draw. They weren't slaves. They had not been slaves. They were musicians. But it was what the promoters used to draw in a white crowd, a white cloud. It also says at the top, no burnt cork here, because they were boasting that they replaced the white performers who sang and played in blackface ever since the 1830s. This was about 1870, 60. They were always perpetuating these minstrel shows, the offensive stereotype that deliberately corrupted the public image of African Americans among Hartford's white citizens. As it turned out later on, and this is a later ad, and it says at the top, commended by William Lloyd Garrison, Oliver Wendell Holmes, J. Russell Lowell, J.T. Fields, and P.T. Barnum. In other words, this was the stamp of approval. We're not racist. We're not racist. Minstrelsy, of course, is historically weighted with negative baggage, and rightly so. The shows themselves, however, when done by black troops with black managers, like Hosea Easton's manager, fostered authentic Jubilee music, right, what we call spirituals, and ragtime, and ultimately jazz. Without these forms of music, the white population would never have known of this music. And while they played into the images that white audiences wanted, they also subverted those images. Again, not all the time, but in these guys' case. As Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, wrote, in one sense, the colored minstrel was poking fun at himself. In another, probably more profound sense, he was poking fun at the white man. Nowhere was this more apparent than the traveling minstrel shows that were not in the United States. They moved out of the United States, and where the atmosphere was quite different in some ways. And so by the time he was 27 years old, this is a fabulous picture of him. A photographer took a picture of him who was a great banjo fan. And he said, please, please, will you come and take a picture? And isn't that a gorgeous picture? I mean, it looks like 21st century photography. When he was 27 years old, Hosea Easton left Hartford and arrived in Hobart, Australia, as a member of the Georgia Minstrels, still at the height of their popularity along the Pacific Circuit, especially Australia, New Zealand, and China. He was singled out by a Sydney, Australia newspaper where the reviewer wrote, he draws considerably on, for his act, he draws considerably on theology and temperance for his witticisms. He was lucky enough to hook up with C.B. Hicks, the African-American impresario of the original Georgia Minstrels, who had a very capable management style, and he combated efforts to maintain independence from the white theatrical establishment that would just as soon rip you off. This is an Australian poster advertising the original Georgia Minstrels. In the center is Hobart, and above Hobart, with a cool haircut, it's Hosea. Hosea spent the rest of his life in Australia, and he teamed up with a dramatic company and performed the internationally acclaimed Uncle Tom's Cabin. Hosea was the first man to play this role, first black man to play this role outside of the United States in the Southern Hemisphere, ever. And just one tour of it ran for 12 weeks to sold-out audiences in Melbourne, Australia. Hosea expanded to other roles, including a theatrical performance of Robinson Crusoe. He eventually formed his own company, the Easton Uncle Tom Company, which toured with racially integrated dramatical and musical acts. Hosea spent the rest of his life in Australia, as I mentioned. Here he is as Uncle Tom. Now, you'll find, if you go to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, they'll talk to you a lot about how Uncle Tom was interpreted in way different ways. In this time, he was treated as an old man, which he wasn't in the book, an old sort of weak man, which he wasn't. But in Australia, they also had these editions of Uncle Tom on stage where Simon Legree spoke as an asthmatic, and Uncle Tom actually beats him up at one point, which I don't think happened in the book, right? Right. Hosea, as I mentioned, spent the rest of his life in Australia, an extraordinarily beloved and respected figure until his death from cancer in 1899. And when he died, he had a large funeral, which became a parade with the musicians marching down the street to the cemetery, because he was especially beloved in the musical community, which was 99% white, and the people of the cities. Some years later, an Australian biographer wrote a letter to the city of Hartford City Hall. They asked for background information on Hosea Easton. The Hartford clerk replied that no one in the city had ever heard of him. As you can see, just by these brief sketches, Talcott served as a political, communal, religious center, spiritual guidance, community building, political action, nonviolent direct action, justice, and faith. These are the principles that embody the history of the Talcott Street Church and its members. Thank you very much. Okay, we got a few minutes. I got a little energy. If you have any questions or comments or stuff that you know that I don't know, which is a lot, yes, please. Yes. Two different river peoples were here. One of them were the Wangnuk, who went from here to Middletown. And they were the most active, and they had they sold a lot of land and lost a lot of land. But the Wangnuk people and the other tribe that I'm forgetting right now, they mostly existed in a compatible way with each other. And when the Dutch showed up, and then the English showed up, they were like, yeah, I'll sign this piece of paper. What is it? Because they didn't own the same way that these English owned stuff, and they were giving up stuff that they did not intend to. There's a whole history of that, but anyway, that's one of the tribes. Any other questions? Anybody from the college? Did I put you to sleep? Say no. Thank you. Any other? Yes.
What was the basis of the legal argument in Jackson v. Fuller?
That's really good. It's kind of complicated, but I'll say it very Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the question is, what was the legal argument that Nancy Jackson used to free herself from her slave master in Georgia? She said he had abandoned her because she had spent 2 years living here unmolested, and then he came back for his property. And she and her lawyers said, no, if you've gone 2 years, that means you didn't intend to bring her back. And it also means that if you came back in 20 years, you could still claim her. Well, that would just open up slavery again, and our state has already dealt with that. So by a 3-2 margin, she won her case. 3-2, get it, right? It could have gone the other way. But as I mentioned, she and Talcott Street Church would have prepared for it. Yes?
Yes, I've been researching Nancy Jackson, and she had poison in her pockets. So
that's right.
if the court ruled against it, it was a very dramatic court. You can
right.
find it in the State Library, Volume 12. And she had poison, and she was sure she was going to kill herself if they sent her back to Bullock's family. She was brought here to be a maid to his daughters. So when the daughters finished their education, he wanted her back.
Right.
And that's when it's a fascinating way that the people of Hartford protected her so she couldn't be found before the trial.
Right. Even though she was petrified by the idea of this, she was strong enough to legally take on slave owners, right, and take some of that power back, because the courts were a place that sometimes you could get justice. But the main place that you got justice was your community. She took the chance, and she won. That's right. I forgot totally about that. That's pretty horrifying. Other questions? Yes? Oh, Pastor Steve Camp of Faith Congregational Church. Everybody? Hello, Pastor Camp, stand up.
Thank you. I appreciated your presentation. Would you say, I've heard you before talk just a little about what was happening in Hartford when Talcott Street and the society started happening?
Well, the Front Street neighborhood, right, which is what we usually call it, or the East Side, I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're looking for, but this was the poorest neighborhood in the city. And it was the commerce district. And so there was a lot of stuff being made and fixed, and a lot of poor people, always immigrants, for a long time African Americans, who couldn't get out of this ghetto purely because they couldn't find a place to live elsewhere. Now, Mark Twain came to Hartford and visited for a number of years before he ever got here. So in the 1860s, right around part of this time, he said, "Where are the poor of Hartford? I confess, I do not know. They are probably hidden away in some small dark corner where I have not yet found them." Well, it was not a small corner. It was a big section of the city. The Irish lived here, the Germans lived here, the Italians lived here, the European Jews lived here. It was always the first stop because this was the port, right? This is where people came in by river. Other stuff? Is that?
Colt's firearm and the faith and justice.
Oh, well, here's another. Maybe I'll get invited to talk about Colt sometime. But Colt was building firearms in Hartford, as people know, because we now have a national monument. But you may or may not know that he was, in his heart, a Copperhead, a pro-slave Democrat, and he even actually, he sponsored a big meeting of businessmen not long after John Brown came here in, I think it was 1857 or so. But Colt was after one thing, and that was money. So he had been building the Southern war machine for 10 years. When they were buying arms from Colt, they were buying arms for their militias. It wasn't for hunters. It was for an army. It was for an army. And his last shipment of rifles went out 2 days after Fort Sumter. He put them in the mail, sent them by UPS. So there's still a record of it. No. And he sent them out 2 days after the war had begun. And everybody was saying, don't worry about it, Sam. Except the New York Times, who said, this is scandalous. This is scandalous. So, I mean, Colt loses on every count here. First of all, he was using the guns and the rifles that killed people in this, 400 400 men in this city died in the war. And he was above all that. He was Mr. Profits before all else. Any other questions? Thanks. Well, my book is over here. It's about Hartford, not exactly what this is about. And I have buttons here. If you haven't seen one, most people have gotten one. Here's my John Brown button. You take one of those if you'd like. The books, however, cost money. So thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. You're way too nice. Thank you.